Bloomberg Economics reports that China has almost 60 million unsold apartments. And if the government doesn't intervene or find a solution, it might take another decade to sell them all. But that isn't even the worst part. Did you know that this number of homes could house everyone in California and New York? Yet, millions of Chinese families are still paying mortgages on apartments that haven't been built. What exactly is going on? In October 2024, new home prices fell for the 16th consecutive month, wiping away the life savings of millions of residents in China. For a country where nearly 70% of household wealth is tied to property, this isn't just an economic slowdown. It's the slow collapse of a dream the government once promised would never break. And the most alarming part? This crisis has been building for decades and is now reaching a terrifying height that no one saw coming. What is China's mortgage crisis turning into? Well, you're about to find out the most shocking secret about China's mortgages in recent times. Let's begin. Back in early 2024, warning signs around the state of China's real estate sector were becoming impossible to ignore. Housing prices across the country had been slipping for well over a year, but October brought a symbolic blow. Across China, home prices were down by 5.9%, but in some smaller cities, they exceeded well over 15%. For millions of families, their homes weren't just a place to live. They were also their savings account, retirement fund, and proof of social stability. Suddenly, that security was beginning to melt away. However, the unrest didn't start in Beijing or Shanghai. It began in smaller cities and provincial towns where unfinished housing projects had been left to rot. Families who had poured every yuan they had into pre-sale apartments discovered that the construction had been halted indefinitely. In many cases, developers simply didn't have the money to finish the buildings, so cash flow was drying up. The credits were shut off. The reality was brutal as buyers were still paying monthly mortgage installments for apartments that existed only as concrete shells with no plumbing, electricity, and sometimes not even walls. Then, on July 1st, 2022, the first organized mortgage boycott was made public. A group of home buyers across central China released an open letter declaring they would stop making mortgage payments unless work on the homes they bought resumed. At first, it seemed like a small act of defiance, as many assumed it was just one housing project among hundreds across the country. But by the evening of that same day, buyers from a second project joined in, and the momentum was immediate. Within 4 weeks, more than 320 projects in about 100 cities were facing similar protests, roiling markets and forcing authorities to corral banks and developers to defuse the unrest. Soon after, the anger was no longer just about housing anymore. Years earlier, protests in China were often led by students or politically active groups. But this time, it was different, as teachers, factory workers, small business owners, and even retirees were the ones showing up in the public demonstrations. Many brought signs demanding accountability from both developers and the government. The sheer diversity of the protesters was a warning sign that the crisis had spilled far beyond the real estate sector. Adding to the tension, 2024 saw a new high rate of youth unemployment in China, with official figures pointing to millions of graduates unable to find work. Consumer spending stalled as retail sales weakened, and households became more cautious. The result of this was the cutting back on travel, dining, and big purchases by many of those affected. The housing crash was no longer just an isolated industry problem. It was now dragging the entire economy down. The Chinese Communist Party could no longer easily ignore what was unfolding. For years, Beijing had relied on the property sector as a pillar of its GDP growth, but now it was becoming a dead weight to carry. The party's officials began to publicly admit that real estate was hurting the economy instead of driving it. This was rare in itself because the leadership of China is known to rarely acknowledge any systemic problems unless they have reached a critical point. Still, China's early responses felt more like damage control than a solution. Amid the chaos, demonstrators and activists were detained, while many others were warned to stop spreading rumors. But behind the scenes, the Chinese government was faced with a growing dilemma. If it continued to suppress any unrest without addressing the root cause, it would only delay the inevitable. In a country where stability remains the highest political priority, that kind of fear is dangerous. As the unrest and protests continued, another question began to surface. How did China get here in the first place? To understand the scale of China's housing crisis, you have to go back more than 2 decades, to the late 1990s. For much of China's modern history, urban housing wasn't something you bought. Instead, it was something that the state assigned to you. Employers or local authorities distributed apartments, and rent was either free or paid as a symbol of something else. But that changed in 1998, when people were given the option to purchase their previously government-owned homes at extremely favorable rates, and most of them made the transition to being property owners. The implementation of these reforms coincided with one of the fastest urban migrations in human history. Millions of people were leaving rural villages each year for booming cities across the world. Urbanization rates continued on a steady upward movement of 33% in 1998, over 60% by 2020, and every new arrival needed somewhere to live. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was now about opportunity, identity, and security. In Chinese culture, home ownership quickly became more than a financial decision. For many families, a home became a prerequisite for marriage. In many provinces, parents would openly state that their son was not ready to marry unless he owned an apartment. Property was also viewed as a retirement plan, and this was because, without the kind of robust pension system seen in the West, owning a home was the surest way to ensure financial stability in old age. On the other hand, developers, while sensing a gold rush, began building at an unprecedented pace. Local governments across China saw an opportunity to make more quick cash too. Under China's land lease system, all urban land technically belongs to the state, which it leases to developers for fixed terms, say 70 years for residential property. In turn, selling these leases become a significant revenue source for local authorities. This created a powerful incentive to keep the construction boom going. So the more developers bid for land, the more money the local government collected. That money was used to fund more infrastructure projects, public services, and in some cases, the personal enrichment of the officials involved. This resulted in a feedback loop, where developers took on huge debts to acquire more land, built more apartments, and sold them often before construction had even started. In turn, people bought them because they believed the prices would always rise. And for years, they were right. From the start of the century to about 2018, housing prices across major cities in China soared by several 100%, even outpacing wage growth and creating immense paper wealth for homeowners. According to Moody's estimates, 70 to 80% of Chinese household assets are tied to real estate, compared to less than 30% in the United States. Instruments such as stocks, mutual funds, and other financial tools all played a much more minor but significant role here. So the over-reliance meant that if the housing market were to stumble, the shock would equally ripple through almost every part of the economy.
The housing oversupply problem is now so bad, it's estimated there are 60 million vacant homes. That's enough to house an entire medium-sized country.
But there was an even darker side to this unbelievable boom. Overbuilding was rampant. The term ghost cities emerged, which comprised vast urban districts with rows of new high-rises, highways, and malls, but very few residents. Some of these housing developments existed more as speculative investments than as functioning communities, and as long as prices kept rising, no one worried about the mismatch between supply and actual demand for these housing units. That mindset that housing prices could never fall became the seed of the mortgage crisis yet to come. The cultural and economic forces that made property the center of Chinese life also made the system extremely fragile. It's this fragility that set the stage for the downfall of one of China's real estate giants. And if one company's collapse could send shockwaves across the country, what happens when the entire sector starts to crumble? If there is one name that has become synonymous with China's housing crisis, it is the Evergrande Group. Once the largest property developer in the country, Evergrande was more than just a business. It was a symbol of the Chinese real estate miracle. Founded in 1996 by Zhu Jiayin in Guangzhou, it grew from a small regional housing developer into a giant whose name was plastered onto billboards, football stadiums, and luxury advertisements across the nation and the world. At its peak in 2017, Evergrande's market value topped $50.06 billion, making it not only the most prominent developer in China, but the largest in all of Asia. In a healthy system, this money would go toward building the homes that had been sold out. But Evergrande, while chasing endless growth, rarely did that. Instead, much of the cash was used to buy even more land for future projects, which could be then pre-sold to another wave of buyers. It was a self-feeding cycle that was almost like a rolling snowball where today's buyers funded tomorrow's promises. And as long as housing prices continued to climb and demand remained strong, the model was working. At this point, Evergrande was sitting on projects in more than 280 cities across China, employing hundreds of thousands directly and indirectly. Zhu Jiayin became one of the wealthiest men in China, with a professional fortune once estimated at $43 billion according to Reuters. The company wasn't just building homes. It began to venture into theme parks, electric vehicles, bottled water, and even owned a professional football team, Guangzhou Evergrande. To many, this looked like a permanent success story, but behind the glitter was an alarming level of debt piling up. Evergrande was borrowing relentlessly from banks, investors, and even its employees, and was offering unfinished apartments as collateral for more loans. By 2020, all hell was let loose when it was revealed that the company owed more than $300 billion, effectively making it one of the most indebted firms in the world. That year, Beijing introduced the 3 Red Lines policy, which was aimed at reining in the overheated property market. The policy was a way of setting strict limits on how much debt developers could take on, based on 3 financial ratios: the liability-to-asset ratio of less than 70%, the net gearing ratio of less than 100%, and the cash-to-short-term debt ratio of less than 1. If a developer breached all 3, they were cut off from new borrowing, and Evergrande failed on all counts. Towards the end of 2021, Evergrande began missing its debt payments and panic spread. Investors, suppliers, and home buyers suddenly realized the company might not survive. When news broke that Evergrande had officially defaulted on offshore debt, it became clear that this was not just an isolated problem. Other developers such as Kaiser Group, Fantasia Holdings, and Sunac China soon faced severe liquidity issues. Confidence in the market collapsed as new buyers became hesitant to purchase homes on presale. Banks were equally worried about exposure, so they tightened their lending criteria, which only worsened the crisis. Evergrande's fall was not just the failure of a single company. It was a chain reaction. Suppliers went unpaid, workers on construction sites walked off the job, and cities that had relied on land sales to Evergrande and its rivals saw their revenues shrink. And at the center of it all were millions of ordinary citizens across the country, left holding mortgage contracts for homes they might never see completed. But while the anger was directed toward developers and local officials, there was also a more profound fear that the very foundations of the financial system were beginning to crack. If mortgages go unpaid, the banks lose money. And if banks lose money, deficits are at risk. And if enough people believe their deficits aren't safe, the next step could be far worse. That's when the crisis stops being about housing and starts threatening the entire economy. China's banking sector was once seen as a fortress that was heavily regulated, backed by the state, and trusted by developers who believed their money was safe no matter what happened. But the housing crash was revealing cracks that were spreading faster than most people expected. Typically, such problems start with bad property loans. For decades, both large and small lending banks poured their money into China's property sector, convinced that the price of housing could only go up. These developers were treated as low-risk borrowers, and buyers were seen as reliable because mortgages were generally paid on time. But when construction stopped amid widespread mortgage boycotts, that assumption quickly collapsed. Suddenly, banks were sitting on loans that were tied to apartments that didn't exist. This is what makes the Chinese crisis especially dangerous compared to what the US faced with its housing crash in 2008. In America, if a homeowner defaulted, the bank could repossess the house and sell it to recover part of the money. In China, many of these loans were backed by homes yet to be built. In essence, there is nothing to seize, and the money is gone. By the middle of 2024, mortgage boycotts and unfinished projects had left banks facing potential exposure in the hundreds of billions of yuan. And it wasn't just the biggest players feeling the pain. Rural and small city lenders were hit especially hard. These banks often had close relationships with local developers, and many had quietly funneled depositors' money into risky real estate ventures without the consent of their depositors. When those investments soured, some banks simply froze more accounts to stop the outflow of cash. This resulted in a swift and angry reaction from the public. In cities like Zhengzhou and Hefei, Depositors could be seen protesting outside bank branches and demanding access to their money. In a country where organized demonstrations are rarely heard of, these scenes were filled with people waving banners, chanting slogans, and confronting security forces. The scale of the damage became clearer when China's regulators announced the forced merger of over 3,800 small leaders into larger state-run institutions. This became the most significant wave of consolidation in China's banking history and a record-level cleanup aimed at preventing an imminent collapse. But even this raised concerns. If hundreds of small banks needed rescuing in a single year, how many more were hiding their problems? China's rural banking sector alone has about 3,700 firms, holding around 57 trillion yuan in assets, which was roughly $7.8 trillion at the time. That's about one-third the size of the entire US banking system. Yet no one knew how much of that was tied up in risky property loans or hidden off-the-books deals with the local governments. The Chinese government has since deployed tools to stabilize its banks, such as capital injections, mergers, and even outright takeovers. But these measures don't solve the underlying problem: trust. Once depositors start believing their money might not be there tomorrow, a bank ruin can happen almost overnight. And in a country of over 1.4 billion people, even a small percentage of the population pulling out their savings could overwhelm the entire system. Perhaps this is why the Chinese Communist Party became so nervous. While the banking sector wrestles with bad loans, the broader economy is showing signs of deeper trouble. In 2024, Chinese industrial profits fell by 3.3%, marking their third consecutive year of decline. Some sectors were even hit harder as automakers saw their earnings drop by 8%. Household borrowing from major purchases like cars and homes is turning negative, meaning people are paying off debt faster than they are taking on new loans. This is a dangerous sign in an economy that has long relied on consumer spending to drive its growth. Families are holding on to their cash, not because they suddenly became frugal, but because they're afraid of what's coming next. The job market is becoming another flashpoint. Back in 2024, a record 11.79 million college graduates enter the workforce, only to find that a degree no longer guaranteed a career. Many end up underemployed or forced to accept salaries far below what their parents earned at the same age. However, it's not just the young who are struggling. According to Reuters, some 94 million working people, around 12.8% of China's 734 million labor force, were older than 60 in 2022. This number is expected to rise as the baby boomer generation reaches retirement age with insufficient funds in their bank accounts. For many, the promise of a peaceful retirement has been replaced with exhausting jobs to make ends meet. All of this is happening against the backdrop of a growing debt problem. Fitch Ratings forecasts China's debt to GDP ratio to rise to 68.3% by the end of 2025 and 74.2% in 2026. This would no doubt push the country's debt levels higher than they were after the 2009 global financial crisis. But unlike then, China's economy is no longer growing fast enough to make such debt manageable. Beijing has tried to fight back with massive stimulus measures. In 2024, China reportedly said it would issue a record $411 billion in special treasury bonds in another wave of attempts to boost the economy. In addition, they've also cut taxes, poured money into infrastructure projects, and launched a substantial spending plan to achieve a 5% annual growth target. However, the results have been underwhelming. People no longer believe that new highways or flashy development zones will fix the underlying issues facing the economy. And as long as that trust is missing, even the most aggressive stimulus plans will struggle to gain traction. The CCP now faces a dangerous dilemma. If they do nothing, the protests, mortgage boycotts, and bank withdrawals could grow into something much larger. But if they intervene too heavily, by bailing out more developers, covering bad loans, or simply printing more money, they risk fueling inflation and creating even more debt. The stakes could not be higher. The question hanging over Beijing is not just whether they can stabilize the housing market, but whether they can prevent the crisis from spreading to every corner of the economy and onto the streets. Because if the past few years have shown anything, it's that when enough people lose faith in the system, even the most powerful government can be forced into choices it never wanted to make. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.